Hi, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the last few chapters and especially the dreams, because I thought those were pretty fun. Okay, today's chapter, first one we're starting with, oh, there goes a mister. The first one is The Great Plan. Here we go. We've absolutely got to stop them, Sophie cried. Put me back in your pocket quick and we'll chase after them and warn everybody in England that they're coming. Redunculous and impossible, the BFG said. They's going 2 times as fast as me and they's finishing their guzzle before we is even halfway. But we can't just sit here doing nothing, Sophie cried. How many girls and boys are they going to eat tonight? Many, the BFG said. The flesh-lump-eating giant alone has a most squawkling wopsy appetite. Will he snatch them out of their beds while they're sleeping? Like peas out of a pottle, the BFG said. Oh, I can't bear to think of it, Sophie cried. Then don't, the BFG said. For years and years I is sitting here on this very rock, every night after night when they is galloping away, and I is feeling so sad for all the human beings they is going to gobble up, but I has had to get used to it. There is nothing I can do. If I wasn't a titchy little runty giant, only 24 feet high, then I would be stopping them, but that is absolutely out of the window. Do you always know where they're going? Sophie asked. Always, the BFG said. Every night they is yelling at me as they go boodling past. The other day they is yelling, we is off to Mississippi and Missouri to guzzle them both. Disgusting, Sophie said. I hate them. She and the big friendly giant sat quietly side by side on the blue rock in the gathering dusk. Sophie had never felt so helpless in her life. After a while, she stood up and cried out, I can't stand it. Just think of those poor girls and boys who are going to be eaten alive in a few hours' time. We can't go on here doing nothing. We've got to go after those brutes. No, the BFG said. We must, Sophie cried. Why won't you go? The BFG sighed and shook his head firmly. I has told you 5 or 6 times, he said, and the 3rd time will be my last. I is never showing myself to human beings. Why ever not? If I do, they will be putting me in the zoo with all of the jiggy-raffies and the caterpillars. Nonsense, Sophie said. And they will be sending you straight back to the orphanage, the BFG went on. Grown-up human beings is not famous for their kindnesses. They is all squiffle-rotters and grink-sludgers. Well, that simply isn't true, Sophie cried angrily. Some of them are very kind indeed. Who? The BFG said. Name one. The Queen of England, Sophie said. You can't call her a squiffle-rotter or a grink-sludger. Well, the BFG said. You can't call her a squick-peep or a not-mucher either, Sophie said, getting angrier and angrier. The flesh-lump-eater is longing dearly to guzzle her up, the BFG said, smiling a little bit now. Who, the Queen? Sophie cried, aghast. Yes, the BFG answered. Flesh-lump-eater says he is never eating a queen and he thinks perhaps she has an especially scrumptiddly-umptious flavor. How dare he, Sophie cried. But Flesh-lump-eater says there is too many soldiers around her palace, so he daresn't try it. Here's a picture of the two of them talking. Well, he'd better not, Sophie said. He is also saying he would like very much to guzzle one of those soldiers in his pretty red suit, but he is worried about those big black furry hats they is wearing. He is thinking they might be sticking in his throat. Well, I hope he chokes, Sophie said. Flesh-lump-eater's a very careful giant, the BFG said. Sophie was silent for a few moments, and then suddenly, in a voice filled with excitement, she cried out, Oh, I've got it! By golly, I think I've got it! Got what? Asked the BFG. The answer, cried Sophie. We'll go to the Queen. This is a terrific idea. If I went and told the Queen about those disgusting man-eating giants, I'm sure she would do something about it. The BFG looked down at her sadly and shook his head. She is never believing you, he said. Never in a month of Mondays. I think she would. Never, the BFG said. It is sounding such a wonky tall story. The Queen would be laughing and saying, What awful rub squash! She would not. Of course she would, the BFG said. I has told you before that human beings is simply not believing in giants. Well, then it's up to us to find a way of making her believe in them, Sophie said. And how is you getting in to see the Queen anyway? The BFG asked. Now hold on a second, Sophie said. Just you hold on, because I've got another idea. Your ideas are full of crodswoggle, the BFG said. Not this one, Sophie said. You say that if we tell the Queen, she would never believe us, right? I is certain she wouldn't, the BFG said. But we aren't going to tell her, Sophie said excitedly. We don't have to tell her. We'll make her dream it. That is an even more froth-bungling suggestion, the BFG said. Dreams is lots of fun, but nobody is believing in dreams either. You is only believing in a dream while you is actually dreaming it. But as soon as you is waking up, you is saying, oh, thank goodness it was only a dream. Well, don't you worry about that part of it, Sophie said. I can fix that. Never can you fix it, the BFG said. I can, I swear I can. But first of all, let me ask you a very important question. Here it is. Can you make a person dream absolutely anything in the world? Anything you like, the BFG said proudly. If I said I wanted to dream that I was in a flying bathtub with silver wings, could you make me dream that? I could, the BFG said. But how? Sophie said. You obviously don't have exactly that dream in your collection. I do not, the BFG said, but I could soon be mixing it up. How could you mix it up? It is a little bit like mixing a cake, the BFG said. If you is putting the right amounts of all the different things into it, you is making the cake come out any way you want. Sugary, spongy, curranty, Christmassy, or grobswitchy. It's the same with dreams. Go on, Sophie said. I has dillions of dreams on my shelves. Left or right? Right, Sophie said. I has dreams about bathtubs, lots of them. I has dreams about silver wings. I has dreams about flying. So all I has to do is mix those dreams together in the proper way, and I is very quickly making a dream where you is flying in a bathtub with silvery wings. I see what you mean, Sophie said. But I didn't know you could mix one dream with another. Oh, dreams like being mixed, the BFG answered. They is getting very lonesome all by themselves in those glassy bottles. Right, Sophie said. Now then, do you have dreams about the Queen of England? Lots of them, the BFG said. And about giants? Of course, the BFG said. And about giants eating people? Swiggles of them, the BFG said. And about little girls like me? Oh, those is the commonest of all, the BFG said. I has bottles and bottles of dreams about little girls. And you could mix them all up just as I want you to? Sophie asked, getting more and more excited. Of course, the BFG said. But how is this helping us? I think you's barking up the wrong dog. Okay, now hold on, Sophie said. Listen carefully. I want you to mix a dream which you will blow into the Queen of England's bedroom when she's asleep, and this is how it will go. Now hang on a mintick, the BFG said. How was I possibly going to get near enough to the Queen of England's bedroom to blow in my dream? You was talking dumb silly. I'll tell you that part later, Sophie said. For the moment, please just listen carefully. Here is the dream I want you to mix. Are you paying attention? Very close, the BFG said. I want the Queen to dream that all 9 disgusting giants, each one about 50 feet tall, are galloping to England in the night. She must dream their names as well. What are their names again? Flesh Lump Eater, the BFG said. Man Hugger, Bone Cruncher, Child Chewer, Meat Dripper, Gizzard Gulper, Maid Masher, Blood Bottler, and the Butcher Boy. Okay, let her dream all those names, Sophie said, and let her dream that they will be creeping into England in the depths of the witching hour and snatching little boys and girls from their beds. Let her dream that they will be reaching into the bedroom windows and pulling the little girls and the boys out of their beds. And then, Sophie paused. Do they eat them on the spot, or do they carry them away first, she asked. They is usually just popping them straight into their mouths like popcorn, the BFG said. Okay, put that in the dream, Sophie said. And then the dream must say that when their tummies are full, they will go galloping back to giant country where no one can find them. Is that all? The BFG asked. Certainly not, Sophie said. You must then explain to the Queen in her dream that there is a big, friendly giant who can tell her where all those beasts are living so that she can send her soldiers and her armies to capture them once and for all. And now let her dream one last and very important thing. Let her dream that there is a little girl called Sophie sitting on her windowsill who will tell her where the big friendly giant is hiding. Oh, where is he hiding? Asked the BFG. We'll come to that later, Sophie said. So the Queen dreams her dream, right? Right, the BFG said. Then she wakes up, and the first thing she'll think is, what a horrid dream. Oh, I'm glad it was only a dream. And then she looks up from her pillow, and what does she see? What does she see? Asked the BFG. She sees a little girl called Sophie sitting on her windowsill, right there in real life before her very eyes. How is you going to be sitting on the Queen's windowsill, may I beg? The BFG asked. You are going to put me there, Sophie said. And that's the lovely part about it. If someone dreams that there's a little girl sitting on her windowsill and then she wakes up and sees that the little girl really is sitting there on her windowsill, that is a dream come true, right? I is beginning to see where you is driving to, the BFG said. If the Queen is knowing that part of her dream is true, then perhaps she is believing the rest of it is true as well. Yes, that's about it, Sophie said. But I shall have to convince her of that myself. You said you was wanting the dream to say there is a big friendly giant who is also going to talk to the Queen? Absolutely, Sophie said. You must. You are the only one who can tell her where to find the other giants. How is I meeting the Queen? Asked the BFG. I is not wanting to be shooted at by her soldiers. The soldiers are only in front of the palace, Sophie said. At the back there's a huge garden and there are no soldiers in there at all. There's a very high wall with spikes on it around the garden to stop people from climbing in, but you could simply walk over it. How is you knowing all about the Queen's palace? The BFG asked. Last year I was in a different orphanage, Sophie said. It was in London, and we used to go for walks all around there. Is you helping me to find this palace? The BFG asked. I has never dared to go hide and sneaking around London in my life. I'll show you the way, Sophie said confidently. I is frightened of London, the BFG said. Oh, don't be, Sophie said. It's full of tiny dark streets and there's very few people about during the witching hour. The BFG picked Sophie up between one finger and a thumb and placed her gently in the palm of his other hand. Is the Queen's palace very big? He asked. Huge, Sophie said. Then how is we finding the right bedroom? Well, that's up to you, Sophie said. You're supposed to be an expert at that sort of thing. And are you absolutely sure the Queen will not put me in a zoo with all of the catty piddlers? Of course she won't, Sophie said. You'll be a hero and you'll never have to eat snozcumbers again. Sophie saw the BFG's eyes widen and he licked his lips. You mean it? He said. You really mean it? No more disgustive snozcumbers? You couldn't even get one if you wanted to, Sophie said. Humans don't grow them. That did it. The BFG got to his feet. When is you wanting me to mix this special dream? He asked. Right now, Sophie said, at once. When is we going to see the Queen? He asked. Tonight, Sophie said, as soon as you've mixed the dream. Tonight? The BFG cried. Why such a flesh-bunking flurry? If we can't save tonight's children, we can anyways save tomorrow's, Sophie said. What is more, I'm getting famished. I haven't had a thing to eat for 24 hours. Well, then we had better get crackling, the BFG said, moving back towards the cave. Sophie kissed him on the tip of his thumb. I knew you'd do it, she said. Come on, let's hurry. Mixing the dream. It was dark now. The night had already begun. The BFG, with Sophie sitting on his hand, hurried into the cave and put on those brilliant, blinding lights that seemed to come from nowhere. He placed Sophie on the table. Stay here, please, he said, and no chittering. I is needing to listen only to silence when I is mixing up such a naughty, plexicated dream as this. He hurried away from her. He got out an enormous glass jar that was empty, the size of a washing machine. He clutched it to his chest and hurried toward the shelves on which stood the thousands and thousands of smaller jars containing the captured dreams. Dreams about giants, he muttered to himself as he searched the labels. The giants is guzzling human beings. No, not that one. No, not that one. Oh, here's one. Oh, here's another. He grabbed the jars and unscrewed the tops. He tipped the dreams into the enormous jar he was clutching, and as each one went in, Sophie caught a glimpse of a small, sea-green blob tumbling from one jar into the other. The BFG hurried towards another shelf. Now, he muttered, I was wanting dreams about giggle houses for girls and about boggle boxes for boys. He was becoming very tense now. Sophie could almost see the excitement bubbling inside him as he scurried back and forth among his beloved jars. There must have been 50,000 dreams altogether up there on the shelves, but he seemed to know almost exactly where every one of them was. Dreams about little girls, he muttered, and dreams about me, about the BFG. Come on, hurry up, get on with it. Oh, now where is that wonky world is I keeping those ones? And so it went on. In about half an hour, the BFG had found all the dreams he wanted and had tipped them into the huge jar. He put the jar on the table. Sophie sat watching him but said nothing. Inside the big jar, lying on the bottom of it, she could clearly see about 50 of these oval sea green jellious shapes, all pulsing gently in and out. some lying on top of others, but each one still a quite separate individual dream. "Now we is mixing them up," the BFG announced. He went to the cupboard where he kept his bottles of Frobscottle, and from it he took out a gigantic egg beater. It was one of those that has a handle which you turn, and down below there are a lot of overlapping blades that go whizzing around. He inserted the bottom end of this contraption into the big jar where the dreams were lying. "Watch," he said. He started turning the handle very fast. I'm going to show you these two pictures. When I was little, I had an egg beater kind of a thing that was exactly like that. So I don't know if you can see that in the picture there. But that's how my mom beat eggs. It was like this contraption, a little handlebar thing with like whisks. Do you know what whisks are? It was like they had two whisks on the bottom that interwove. So she'd hold the handle and turn a crank like this, and those whisks would move around and mix up your eggs. So that's kind of the thing he's using. Flashes of green and blue exploded inside the jar. The dreams were being whisked into a sea green froth. "Oh, the poor things," Sophie cried. "They is not feeling it," the BFG said as he turned the handle. "Dreams is not like human beings or animals. They has no brains. They is made of zosimus." After about a minute, the BFG stopped whisking. The whole bottle was now full to the brim with large bubbles. They were almost exactly like the bubbles we ourselves blow from soapy water, except that these had even brighter and more beautiful colors swimming on their surfaces. "Keep watching," the BFG said. Quite slowly, the topmost bubble rose up through the neck of the jar and floated away. A second one followed, and then a third and a fourth. And soon the cave was filled with hundreds of beautifully colored bubbles, all drifting gently through the air. It was truly a wonderful sight. As Sophie watched them, they all started floating towards the entrance of the cave, which was still open. "They're going out," Sophie whispered. "Of course," the BFG said. "Where to?" "Those is all the little tiny dream bits that I isn't using," the BFG said. "They is going back to the misty country to join up with proper dreams." "This is all a little beyond me," Sophie said. "Dreams is full of mystery and magic," the BFG said. "Do not try to understand them. Look in the big bottle, and now you will see the dream you is wanting for the queen." Sophie turned and stared into the great jar. On the bottom of it, something was thrashing around wildly, bouncing up and down and flinging itself against the walls of the jar. "Good heavens," she cried. "Is that it?" "That's it," the BFG cried proudly. "But it's horrible," Sophie cried. "It's jumping about. It wants to get out." "That's because it's a trogglehumper," the BFG said. "It's a nightmare." "Oh, no, I don't want you to give the queen a nightmare," Sophie cried. "If she is dreaming about giants guzzling up little boys and girls, and then what is you expecting it to be except a nightmare?" the BFG said. "Oh, no," Sophie cried. "Oh, yes," said the BFG. "A dream is where you is seeing little chidlers being eaten. It is about the most frightsome troggle-humping dream you can get. It's a kicksy bog-thumper. It's a wopsy grobswitcher. It's all of them riddled into one. It is as bad as that dream I blew into the flesh lump eater this afternoon. It is worse." Sophie stared down at the fearful nightmare dream that was thrashing about in the huge glass jar. It was much larger than the others. It was about the size and shape of, shall we say, a turkey's egg? It was jellyish. It had tinges of bright scarlet deep inside it. There was something terrible about the way it was throwing itself against the sides of the jar. "I don't want to give the queen a nightmare," Sophie said. "I is thinking," the BFG said, "that your queen will be happy to have a nightmare if having a nightmare is going to save a lot of human beings from being gobbled up by filthsome giants. Is I right or left?" "I suppose you're right," Sophie said. "I guess it's got to be done." "She will soon be getting over it," the BFG said. "Have you put all the other important things into it?" Sophie asked. "When I is blowing that dream into the queen's bedroom," the BFG said, "she will be dreaming every single little thing-a-ling-a-ling that you asked me to make her dream." "About me sitting on the windowsill?" "That part is very strong." "And about the big friendly giant?" "I is putting in a nice long gobbet about him," the BFG said. As he spoke, he picked up one of the smaller jars and very quickly tipped the struggling, thrashing trogglehumper out of the large jar and into the smaller one. Then he screwed the lid tightly on the small jar. "That's it," he announced. "We is now ready." He fetched his suitcase and put the small jar into it. "Why bother to take a great big suitcase when you've only got one jar?" Sophie asked. "You could just put the jar in your pocket." The BFG looked down at her and smiled. "By goggles," he said, taking the jar out of the suitcase. Your head is not quite so full of grime sludge after all. I can see you was not born last week." "Well, thank you, kind sir," Sophie said, making a little curtsy from the tabletop. "Is you ready to leave?" the BFG asked. "I'm ready," Sophie cried. Her heart was beginning to thump at the thought of what they were about to do. It really was a wild and crazy thing. Perhaps they'd both be thrown in prison. The BFG was putting on his great black cloak. He tucked the jar into the pocket of his cloak. He picked up his long trumpet-like dream blower, and then he turned and looked at Sophie, who was still on the tabletop. "The dream bottle is in my pocket," he said. "Is you going to sit in there with it during the travel?" "Never," cried Sophie. "I refuse to sit next to that ghastly thing." "Then where is you going to sit?" the BFG asked her. Sophie looked him over for a few moments, and then she said, "If you would be kind enough to swivel one of your big lovely ears so that it's lying flat like a dish, that would make a very cozy place for me to sit." "By gumbo, that is a squawkling good idea," the BFG said. Slowly, he swiveled his huge right ear until it was like a great shell facing up to the heavens. He lifted Sophie up and placed her into it. The ear itself, which was about the size of a large tea tray, was full of the same exact channels and crinkles as a human ear. It was extremely comfortable. "I hope I don't fall down your ear hole," Sophie said, edging away from the large hole just beside her. Take a moment and feel your ear and feel all those little, crevices and cracks and stuff, and then you know where the hole is in your ear. So if you can imagine your ear being swiveled so that it was facing upright, and Sophie's sitting in there. Crazy. "Be very careful not to do that," the BFG said. "You would be giving me a cronking earache." The nice thing about being there was that she could whisper directly into his ear. "Oh, you's tickling me a bit," the BFG said. "Please do not jiggle about." "I'll try not to," Sophie said. "Are we ready?" "Ow!" yelled the BFG. "Don't do that!" "I didn't do anything," Sophie said. "You was talking too loud. You was forgetting that I is hearing every little thing-a-ling-a-ling 50 times louder than usual, and there you is shouting right away inside my ear." "Oh, gosh," Sophie murmured. "I forgot. Sorry." "Your voice is sounding like thunder and trumpets." "I'm so sorry," Sophie whispered. "Is that better?" "No," cried the BFG. "It sounds as though you was shootling off a big blunderbuss," whatever that is. "Well, then how can I talk to you?" Sophie whispered. "Don't!" cried the BFG. "Please don't! Each word is like you was dropping buzz bombs in my ear hole." Sophie tried speaking right under her breath. "Is this better?" she asked. She spoke so softly that she couldn't even hear her own voice. "That's better," the BFG said. "Now I is hearing you very nicely. What is it you was trying to say to me just now?" "I was saying, are we ready?" "We is off," cried the BFG, heading for the cave entrance. "We is off to meet Her Magister, the Queen." Outside the cave, he rolled the large round stone back into place and set off at a tremendous gallop. Journey to London. The great yellow wasteland lay dim and milky in the moonlight as the big friendly giant went galloping across it. Sophie, still wearing only her nightie, was reclining comfortably in a crevice of the BFG's right ear. She was actually in the outer rim of the ear, near the top, where the edge of the ear folds over, and this folding over bit made a sort of roof for her and gave her wonderful protection against the rushing wind. What is more, she was lying on skin that was soft and warm and almost velvety. Nobody, she told herself, had ever traveled in greater comfort. Sophie peeped over the rim of the ear and watched the desolate landscape of giant country go whizzing by. They were certainly moving fast. The BFG went bouncing off the ground as though there were rockets in his toes. And with each stride, he took... The BFG went bouncing off the ground as though there were rockets in his toes, and each stride he took lifted him about 100 feet into the air. 100 feet, that's very high. But he had not yet gone into that whizzing top gear of his when the ground became blurred by speed and the wind howled and his feet didn't even seem to be touching anything but air. That would come later. Sophie had not slept for a long time. She was very tired. She was also warm and comfortable. She dozed off. She didn't know how long she slept, but when she woke up again and looked out over the edge of the ear, the landscape had changed completely. They were in a green country now, with mountains and forests. It was still dark, but the moon was shining as brightly as ever. Suddenly, and without slowing his pace, the BFG turned his head sharply to the left. For the first time during the entire journey, he spoke a few words. "Look, quick, quick, over there," he said, pointing his long trumpet. Sophie looked in the direction he was pointing. Through the murky darkness, all she saw at first was a great cloud of dust about 300 yards away. "Those is all the other giants galloping back after their guzzle," the BFG said. And then Sophie saw them. In the light of the moon, she saw all 9 of those monstrous, half-naked brutes thundering across the landscape together. They were galloping in a pack, their necks craned forward, their arms bent at the elbows, and worst of all, their stomachs bulging. The strides they took were incredible. Their speed was unbelievable. Their feet pounded and thundered on the ground and left a great sheet of dust behind them. But in 10 seconds, they were gone. There's a picture. A lot of little girlsies and boysies is no longer sleeping in their own beds tonight, the BFG said. Sophie felt quite ill. But this grim encounter made her more than ever determined to go through with her mission. It must have been about an hour or so later that the BFG began to slow his pace. "We is in England now," he said suddenly. Dark though it was, Sophie could see that they were in a country of green fields with neat hedges in between the fields. There were hills with trees all over them, and occasionally there were roads with the lights of cars moving along. Each time they came to a road, the BFG was over it and away, and no motorist could possibly have seen anything except a quick black shadow flashing overhead. All at once, a curious orange-colored glow appeared in the night sky ahead of them. "We is coming close to London," the BFG said. He slowed to a trot. He began looking about cautiously. Groups of houses were now appearing on all sides, but there were still no lights in their windows. It was too early for anyone to be getting up quite yet. "Someone's bound to see us," Sophie said. "Never is they seen me," the BFG said confidently. "You is forgetting that I is doing this sort of thing for years and years and years. No human being is ever catching even the smallest wink of me." "I did," Sophie whispered. "Ah," he said. "Yes, but you was the very first." During the next half hour, things moved so swiftly and so silently that Sophie, crouching in the giant's ear, was unable to understand exactly what was going on. They were in streets. There were houses everywhere. Sometimes there were shops. There were bright lamps in the streets. There were quite a few people about, and there were cars with lights on, but nobody ever noticed the BFG. It was impossible to understand quite how he did it. There was a kind of magic in his movements. He seemed to melt into the shadows. He would glide. That was the only word to describe his way of moving. He would glide noiselessly from one dark place to another, always moving, always gliding forward through the streets of London, his black cloak blending with the shadows of the night. It is quite possible that 1 or 2 late-night wanderers might have thought they saw a tall, black shadow skimming swiftly down a murky side street, but even if they had, they would never have believed their own eyes. They would have dismissed it as an illusion and blamed themselves for seeing things that weren't really there. Sophie and the BFG came at last to a large place full of trees. There was a road running through it and a lake. There were no people in this place, and the BFG stopped for the first time since they had set out from his cave many hours before. "What's the matter?" Sophie whispered in her under-the-breath voice. "I is in a bit of a puddle," he said. "You're doing marvelously," Sophie whispered. "No, I isn't," he said. "I is now completely boggled. I is lost." "But why?" "Because we is meant to be in the middle of London, and suddenly we is in a green pasture." "Oh, don't be silly," Sophie whispered. "This is the middle of London. It's called Hyde Park. I know exactly where we are." "You is joking." "I'm not. I swear I'm not. We're almost there." "You mean we is nearly at the Queen's Palace?" cried the BFG. "Yes, it's just across the road," Sophie whispered. "This is where I take over." "Okay, which way?" the BFG said. This is him looking a little lost. "Straight ahead." The BFG trotted forward through the deserted park. "Now stop." The BFG stopped. "You see that huge roundabout ahead of us just outside the park?" Sophie whispered. "I see it. That's Hyde Park Corner." Even now, when it was still an hour before dawn, there was quite a lot of traffic moving around Hyde Park Corner. Then Sophie whispered, "In the middle of the roundabout, there's an enormous stone arch with a statue of a horse and rider on top of it. Can you see that?" The BFG peered through the trees. "I is seeing it," he said. Do you think that if you took a very fast run at it, you could jump clear over Hyde Park Corner, over the arch, and over the horse and rider, and land on the pavement on the other side? Easy, the BFG said. You're sure? You're absolutely sure? I promise, the BFG said. Whatever you do, you mustn't land in the middle of Hyde Park Corner. Don't get so flussed, the BFG said. To me, that is a snitchy little jump. There's not a thing-a-ling-a-ling to it. Then go, Sophie whispered. The BFG broke into a full gallop. He went scorching across the park, and just before he reached the railings that divided it from the street, he took off. It was a gigantic leap. He flew high over Hyde Park Corner and landed as softly as a cat on the pavement on the other side. Well done, Sophie whispered. Now quick, over the wall. Directly in front of them, bordering the pavement, there was a brick wall with fearsome-looking spikes all along the top of it. A swift crouch, a little leap, and the BFG was over it. We're here, Sophie whispered excitedly. We're in the Queen's back garden. The palace. By gumdrops, whispered the big friendly giant. Is this really it? Yes, there's the palace, Sophie whispered back. Not more than 100 yards away, through the tall trees in the garden, across the mown lawns and the tidy flower beds, the massive shape of the palace itself loomed through the darkness. It was made of whitish stone. The sheer size of it staggered the BFG. But this place is having 100 bedrooms at least, he said. Easily, I should think, Sophie whispered. Then I is boggled, the BFG said. How was I possibly finding the one where the Queen is sleeping? Let's go a bit closer and have a look, Sophie whispered. The BFG glided forward among the trees. Suddenly, he stopped dead. The great ear in which Sophie was sitting began to swivel around. Hey, Sophie whispered, you're going to tip me out. Shh, the BFG whispered back. I is hearing something. He stopped behind a clump of bushes. He waited. The ear was still swinging this way and that. Sophie had to hang on tight to the side of it to save herself from tumbling out. The BFG pointed through a gap in the bushes, and there, not more than 50 yards away, she saw a man padding softly across the lawn. He had a guard dog with him on a leash. The BFG stayed as still as a stone. So did Sophie. The man and the dog walked on and disappeared into the darkness. You was telling me that there was no soldiers in the back, the BFG whispered. He wasn't a soldier, Sophie whispered. He was some sort of a watchman. We'll have to be careful. I is not too worried, the BFG said. These waxy big ears of mine is picking up even the noise of a man breathing on the other side of the garden. How much longer before it begins to get light, Sophie whispered. Very short, the BFG said. We must go pell-mell for leather now. He glided forward through the vast garden, and once again Sophie noticed how he seemed to melt into the shadows wherever he went. His feet made no sound at all, even when he was walking on gravel. Suddenly, they were right up close against the back wall of the great palace. The BFG's head was level with the upper windows, one flight up, and so Sophie, sitting in his ear, had the same view. In all the windows on that floor, the curtains seemed to be drawn. There were no lights showing anywhere. In the distance, they could hear the muted sound of traffic going around Hyde Park Corner. The BFG stopped and put his other ear, the one Sophie wasn't in, close to the first window. No, he whispered. What are you listening for? Sophie whispered back. For breathing, the BFG whispered. I is able to tell if it is a man-human being or a lady by the breathing voice. We has a man in there, snortling a little bit too. He glided on, flattening his tall, thin, black, cloaked body against the side of the building. He came to the next window. He listened. No, he whispered. He moved on. This room is empty, he whispered. He listened in at several more windows, but at each one he shook his head and moved on. When he came to the window in the very center of the palace, he listened, but did not move on. Oh, he whispered, we has a lady sleeping in here. Sophie felt a little quiver go running down her spine. But who? She whispered back. The BFG put a finger up to his lips for silence. He reached up through the open window and parted the curtains ever so slightly. The orange glow from the night sky over London crept into the room and cast a glimmer of light onto its walls. It was a large room, a lovely room. A rich carpet, gilded chairs, a dressing table, a bed, and on the pillow of the bed lay the head of a sleeping woman. Sophie suddenly found herself looking at a face she had seen on stamps and coins and in the newspaper all of her life. For a few seconds she was speechless. Is that her? The BFG whispered. Yes, Sophie whispered back. The BFG wasted no time. First, and very carefully, he started to raise the lower half of the large window. The BFG was an expert on windows. He had opened thousands of them over the years. Some windows got stuck, some were wobbly, some creaked. He was pleased to find that the Queen's window slid upward like silk. He pushed up the lower half as far as it would go so as to leave the place for Sophie to sit on he pushed up the lower half as far as it would go so as to leave a place on the sill for Sophie to sit. Next, he closed the crack of in the curtains. Then, with finger and thumb, he lifted Sophie up and out of his ear and placed her on the window ledge with her legs dangling just inside the room, but still behind the curtains. "Now don't you go tip-toppling backwards," the BFG whispered. "You must always be holding on tight with both hands to the inside of the windowsill." Sophie did as he said. It was summertime in London and the night was not cold, but don't forget that Sophie was wearing only her little thin nightie. She would have given anything for a dressing gown, not just to keep her warm, but to hide the whiteness of her nightie from the watchful eyes from the garden below. The BFG was taking the glass jar from the pocket of his cloak. He unscrewed the lid, and now, very cautiously, he poured the precious dream into the wide end of his trumpet. He steered the trumpet through the curtain far into the room, aiming it at the place where he knew the bed to be. He took a deep breath, he puffed out his cheeks, and poof, he blew. Now he was withdrawing the trumpet, sliding it out very carefully like a thermometer. "Is you all right sitting there?" he whispered. "Yes," Sophie murmured. She was quite terrified, but determined not to show it. She looked down over her shoulder. The ground seemed miles away. It was a nasty drop. "How long will it take for the dream to work?" Sophie whispered. "Some takes an hour," the BFG whispered back. "Some is quicker. Some is slower still. But it is sure to find her in the end." Sophie said nothing. "I is going off to wait in the garden," the BFG whispered. "When you is wanting me, just call out my name and I is coming very quick." "Will you hear me?" Sophie whispered. "You is forgetting these," the BFG whispered, smiling and pointing to his great ears. "Goodbye," Sophie whispered. And suddenly, unexpectedly, the BFG leaned forward and kissed her gently on the cheek. Sophie felt like crying. When she turned to look at him, he was already gone. He had simply melted away into the dark garden. That's where we'll end for today. I hope you enjoyed it.